You're listening to the Relational Safety Podcast. I'm Stephanie Underwood, registered social worker and trauma therapist. Today's episode is about something I think is one of the most important conversations we need to be having in the trauma field right now. The gap between the trauma treatments we have and the trauma that most people actually carry. This is a longer episode, and I want you to stay with me because the thing I'm going to talk about today is something that almost nobody is talking about publicly, and it matters. It matters for therapists, and it matters even more for the people sitting across from us in therapy rooms who are trying to heal. Let me start with the thing that most people don't know. The distinction between single event trauma and relational trauma is the most clinically important distinction in the trauma field, and it is the one that is most consistently collapsed in both popular and professional conversations about treatment. Single event trauma is the category for which PTSD was originally defined, and it is the category for which all of our evidence-based treatments were developed. It involves exposure to a discrete, identifiable traumatic event or series of events. A car accident, a combat deployment, a single physical or sexual assault, a natural disaster. The trauma has a beginning and an end. The threat is external, identifiable, and in most cases, no longer present after the event. The nervous system was overwhelmed by a specific experience, and the symptoms that follow, flashbacks, hypervigilance, avoidance, arousal, are the nervous system's continued response to a threat that has passed. Relational trauma is categorically different. It refers to the chronic, repeated exposure to harm, neglect, or instability within the relationships that are supposed to provide safety. And it occurs during the developmental period when the nervous system is being formed. The source of the threat is not external. It is the attachment figure. The trauma does not have a discrete beginning and end. It is the relational environment itself. And the threat does not resolve when the event passes because the events do not pass. They are ongoing, cumulative, and woven into the developmental architecture of the person's nervous system. Judith Herman, who first proposed the concept of complex PTSD in her 1992 work, Trauma and Recovery, recognized that the clinical presentation of relational trauma differs fundamentally from single-event PTSD. She wrote that prolonged, repeated trauma produces changes in personality structure, emotional regulation, and relational capacity that are not captured by the PTSD diagnosis. The World Health Organization agreed, and in the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases, complex PTSD was recognized as a distinct diagnosis, separate from PTSD, characterized not only by the 3 core PTSD symptom clusters, but by 3 additional clusters reflecting disturbances in self-organization, affective dysregulation, negative self-concept, and disturbed relationships. The DSM-5, notably, does not include complex PTSD as a diagnosis. Bessel van der Kolk and colleagues proposed developmental trauma disorder for inclusion in the DSM-5, backed by a field trial involving over 400 children, and the proposal was rejected. The absence of a relational trauma diagnosis in the DSM is not a clinical conclusion that relational trauma does not exist. It is a decision that has significant consequences for how relational trauma is researched, funded, treated, and understood, because the absence of a formal diagnosis means the absence of a research framework for developing treatments specifically designed for it. This is the foundational problem. We have a diagnosis for single event trauma, PTSD, and we have treatments for it. We have a diagnosis for relational trauma, complex PTSD, in the ICD, but not in the DSM, and we do not have treatments that were developed, studied, or validated specifically for it. We are treating a condition that our diagnostic system has not fully recognized with treatments that were designed for a different condition. The treatments that are most commonly recommended for trauma, EMDR, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and trauma-focused CBT, share one critical feature that is rarely discussed in the popular conversation about trauma therapy. Their evidence base was built almost entirely on single-event PTSD populations. EMDR was developed by Francine Shapiro in the late 1980s and has accumulated a substantial evidence base for the treatment of PTSD. The studies that established that evidence base, however, were conducted primarily with populations who had experienced discrete traumatic events: combat, accidents, single assaults. The randomized controlled trials that demonstrated EMDR's efficacy for PTSD measured outcomes against the DSM criteria for PTSD, which are designed to capture the response to a specific, identifiable traumatic event. Cognitive processing therapy was developed by Patricia Resick specifically for the treatment of PTSD in sexual assault survivors, and its evidence base was subsequently expanded to include combat veterans. Prolonged exposure was developed by Edna Foa, again with a primary focus on PTSD as defined by the DSM. Trauma-focused CBT was developed for children and adolescents with PTSD, again within the PTSD diagnostic framework. None of these treatments were developed specifically for relational trauma. None were studied primarily with populations carrying the chronic, developmental, relational trauma that most therapists actually see in clinical practice. And while some research has begun to examine these treatments with complex PTSD populations, the evidence remains limited, preliminary, and far from the standard required to call these treatments evidence-based for relational trauma specifically. This is not a criticism of these treatments. They have demonstrated genuine efficacy for the populations they were studied with. The criticism is of the assumption that efficacy for single-event PTSD translates to efficacy for relational trauma. That assumption is not well supported by the existing evidence, and it is driving clinical practice in a direction the research has not validated. There is some promising research. Cloyter and colleagues have conducted some of the most significant research on treatment for complex trauma, demonstrating that phase-based approaches, which begin with skills training in effective and interpersonal regulation before moving to trauma processing, may be more effective for complex PTSD than immediate trauma-focused treatment. This finding is clinically intuitive and consistent with what most experienced trauma therapists observe in practice. Relational trauma clients often need significant preparatory work in stabilization and regulation before they can safely engage with trauma processing. But this research is still emerging, and phase-based treatment for complex PTSD has not been adopted as a standard of care in the way that single-event PTSD treatments have been. In 2017, the American Psychological Association published its clinical practice guideline for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder in adults. The guideline strongly recommended 4 treatments: cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, trauma-focused CBT, and medication. EMDR was given a conditional recommendation, which many in the field interpreted as a reclassification to second-line status. The APA's stated rationale for the conditional recommendation was based on a systematic review of the available evidence. The guidelines methodology evaluated the strength of the evidence supporting each treatment and assigned recommendations accordingly. The strong recommendations were based on a larger and more consistent body of randomized controlled trial data. The conditional recommendation for EMDR reflected, in the APA's assessment, a somewhat less robust evidence base relative to the strongly recommended treatments. The reclassification was controversial. EMDR proponents, including EMDR International Association, noted that EMDR has received the highest level of recommendation in other clinical practice guidelines worldwide, including those from the World Health Organization and the Department of Veterans Affairs. A formal critique was published, arguing that the APA's methodology may have undervalued the existing EMDR evidence. When the APA updated its guidelines in 2025, EMDR's conditional second-line recommendation was maintained, while CPT, PE, and TFCBT retained their first-line status. The continued placement of EMDR behind the cognitive behavioral treatments was notable, particularly given that other international guidelines continued to classify EMDR as first-line. My clinical observation is that the APA's reclassification, whether intentional or not, might also reflect an implicit recognition that the evidence base for EMDR, like that of the other strongly recommended treatments, was built primarily on single-event PTSD. The question the field has not adequately addressed is not whether EMDR works for PTSD. The evidence for that is substantial. The question is whether it works for the kind of trauma that most therapists are actually treating, and the evidence for that is far less established. I want to be clear that this is my clinical perspective, not a definitive statement about the APA's reasoning. The APA's published rationale focuses on the strength and consistency of the evidence base, not on the type of trauma being treated. But the gap between the evidence base and the clinical reality is real, and it deserves more attention than the conversation about EMDR's reclassification has given it. The clinical problem is not simply that we are using treatments validated for one type of trauma to treat another. The problem is that single-event trauma and relational trauma produce fundamentally different nervous system adaptations, and the treatments designed for one may not address the adaptations produced by the other. Single-event PTSD is, at its core, a disorder of memory processing. The traumatic memory is inadequately processed and remains stored in the nervous system as a present tense threat, producing the flashbacks, hypervigilance, and arousal that characterize the diagnosis. Treatments like EMDR, PE, and CPT are designed to facilitate the processing of these specific traumatic memories so that they can be integrated into the person's autobiographical memory as past events rather than present threats. For single-event PTSD, this approach is clinically appropriate and empirically supported. Relational trauma produces a different set of adaptations. The nervous system that grew up inside an unsafe relational environment did not simply fail to process a specific memory. It developed an entire architecture of prediction about relationships, safety, and self-worth that is encoded not as a discrete memory, but as the baseline operating system of the person's relational life. The adaptations include attachment strategies, maladaptive schemas, chronic nervous system dysregulation, difficulties with emotional regulation, and a disrupted sense of self that are not the products of a single unprocessed memory. They are the products of a developmental environment that shaped the nervous system's fundamental predictions about whether relationships are safe, whether the self is worthy, and whether other people can be trusted. Treating relational trauma as if it were single event PTSD is like treating a chronic illness with a medication designed for acute symptoms. The medication may provide some relief. It may address some symptoms, but it does not address the underlying condition. And the relief it provides is often partial and temporary. This is what I observe in clinical practice, and it is what many of my colleagues describe as well. Clients who have done EMDR for a specific traumatic memory and found that the specific memory lost its charge, but their overall relational pattern, their attachment strategy, their nervous system's baseline prediction about relationships remained unchanged. The treatment worked for what it was designed to work on. It was not designed for what the client actually needed. This is the part of the conversation that matters most, and it is the part that is almost never discussed in the literature on trauma treatment. Healing from relational trauma is difficult enough on its own. The nervous system that grew up inside unsafe relationships has been running the same predictions for decades, and revising those predictions requires sustained, consistent, embodied experiences of relational safety over a long period of time. It is slow work, it is demanding work, and it requires a kind of patience and tolerance for uncertainty that is genuinely hard to sustain. Now imagine that the person doing this work is also trying treatment after treatment, each one promoted as evidence-based, each one recommended by a therapist they trust, and each one producing partial or temporary results that do not address the core of what they are carrying. EMDR for the specific memories, CPT for the cognitions, PE for the avoidance, CBT for the symptoms. Each treatment addresses a piece of the picture, and none of them address the whole. What do you think happens? The person starts to blame themselves, not the treatment, not the evidence base, not the gap between what the research studied and what they are carrying. They blame themselves because they are the one variable in the equation that they can see, and because the narrative that they are not healing because they are too broken, too damaged, or too resistant is one that their nervous system has been generating since long before they entered therapy. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm too broken. I'm treatment resistant. I'm beyond help. These are not just thoughts. They are schemas. They are the precise maladaptive predictions that the relational trauma produced in the first place. The defectiveness schema, the failure schema, the abandonment schema, the emotional deprivation schema. The very structures that the therapy was meant to heal are being reinforced by the experience of the therapy not working, and the person leaves treatment more convinced of their own fundamental inadequacy than when they entered. This is the clinical consequence of the research gap. It is not a theoretical problem. It is not an academic concern. It is a problem that is being experienced right now by real people in therapy rooms everywhere. And it is a problem that the field has not adequately acknowledged. When a treatment does not work, the question should not be, what is wrong with the client? The question should be whether the treatment was designed for the kind of trauma the client is carrying. But because we do not have a research framework that distinguishes between single event and relational trauma at the treatment level, the question defaults to the client, and the client defaults to the schemas, and the schemas get stronger. The need for research specifically addressing relational trauma treatment is not optional. It is urgent, and it is urgent for 3 reasons. First, the majority of therapists, psychologists, and social workers are working with relational trauma, not single event PTSD. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACE study, found that 67% of the general population reported at least one adverse childhood experience, and over 12% reported 4 or more. ACEs were associated with significantly increased risk for depression, anxiety, substance use, and a wide range of physical and mental health outcomes. The CDC estimates that ACEs are attributable for approximately 30% of anxiety cases and 40% of depression cases in North America. In clinical practice, the proportion of clients presenting with relational or developmental trauma is substantially higher than the proportion presenting with single event PTSD. Most therapists I speak with across disciplines and settings report that the majority of their caseload involves clients with histories of childhood emotional neglect, chronic family dysfunction, parental mental illness or addiction, emotional or physical abuse, or attachment disruption. Single event PTSD, while real and significant, is a smaller portion of what most clinicians actually see. We are, as a field, treating a condition we have not adequately studied, and we are using treatments that were validated for a different condition. This is not a sustainable clinical framework. Second, we are treating clients without a research-backed treatment for their specific type of trauma. Technically, we do not have a single trauma treatment that has been developed, studied, and validated specifically for relational trauma through the kind of rigorous, large-scale, randomized, controlled trials that establish the evidence base for single-event PTSD treatments. We have treatments that show promise. Schema therapy has demonstrated effectiveness for personality disorders and has been studied in the context of complex trauma. Phase-based approaches have shown encouraging results for complex PTSD. Emotion-focused therapy and attachment-based approaches have theoretical and emerging empirical support. But none of these have the kind of research base that would allow them to be called evidence-based for relational trauma, in the way that CPT, PE, and TFCBT are evidence-based for single-event PTSD. This does not mean these treatments do not work. It means we do not have the research to prove that they do. And the absence of that research is not a neutral fact. It shapes what gets funded, what gets taught in graduate programs, what gets recommended in clinical practice guidelines, and what clients have access to through insurance and public health systems. Third, and this is the one that matters most to me, the cost of the research gap is being paid by the clients. Every client who tries an evidence-based trauma treatment designed for single-event PTSD experiences partial or no improvement and concludes that they are the problem is paying the cost of the research gap. Every client who has been through multiple therapists, multiple modalities, and multiple courses of treatment without sustained improvement is paying the cost. Every client whose schemas have been reinforced by the experience of treatment failure is paying the cost. The research gap is not an abstract academic concern. it has a human cost. And that cost is being borne by the people who are most vulnerable, most in need of effective treatment, and least equipped to question whether the treatment they are receiving was designed for the kind of trauma they are carrying. Healing from relational trauma requires something fundamentally different from the processing of discrete traumatic memories. It requires the revision of the nervous system's baseline predictions about relationships, safety, and self-worth. And that revision does not happen through a single therapeutic intervention or a single course of treatment. It happens through the sustained, repeated, embodied experience of relational safety over a long enough period that the nervous system begins to update its predictions. This is the core principle of the relational safety framework. Healing from relational trauma is not primarily a cognitive process. It is a regulatory process. The nervous system that learned danger inside relationships can only learn safety inside relationships. And that learning requires the same conditions that produced the original adaptation. Real relational experience repeated consistently over enough time to change the underlying prediction. This is why the therapeutic relationship itself is so central to the treatment of relational trauma, and why treatments that focus primarily on processing memories or challenging cognitions, while valuable for single event PTSD, are often insufficient for relational trauma. The client's nervous system did not learn that relationships are unsafe through a single event. It learned it through thousands of interactions over years of development. Revising that learning requires thousands of interactions in the opposite direction. And those interactions need to occur in a relational context that is safe enough, consistent enough, and sustained enough that the nervous system can begin to take in the new data. Phase-based approaches, which begin with stabilization and skills training before moving to trauma processing, are more consistent with this understanding. Schema therapy, which directly targets the maladaptive predictions formed in childhood and uses the therapeutic relationship as a corrective relational experience, is more consistent with this understanding. Attachment-based therapy, which focuses on the relational patterns that organize the person's relational life, is more consistent with this understanding. But all of these approaches need more research, more funding, and more attention from the institutions that shape clinical practice. The field needs to invest in the study of treatments designed specifically for relational trauma. Not adaptations of single event treatments, but approaches developed from the ground up to address the specific adaptations that relational trauma produces. The attachment strategies, the schema structures, the nervous system dysregulation, and the disrupted sense of self that are the hallmark of complex PTSD. The ICD's recognition of complex PTSD as a distinct diagnosis was an important step. The research infrastructure to develop and validate treatments for it needs to follow. If you have tried trauma therapy and felt like it did not work, I need you to hear something. The problem may not be you. The problem may be that the treatment you received was designed for a different kind of trauma than the one you are carrying, and the field has not yet developed and validated the treatments that relational trauma specifically requires. This is not your fault. You are not treatment resistant. You are not too broken. You are not beyond help. You are carrying a kind of trauma that the mental health system has not adequately studied, and you are being offered treatments that were designed for a different kind of trauma. and the gap between what you need and what is available is real. The healing is possible. The nervous system that learned danger inside relationships is fully capable of learning safety inside them. But the healing requires the right kind of relational experience, sustained over enough time in a context that understands the difference between processing a single traumatic memory and revising the fundamental architecture of a nervous system that was built inside unsafe relationships. That work is happening. It is happening in therapy rooms where clinicians understand relational trauma, where the therapeutic relationship is recognized as the primary intervention, and where the goal is not the processing of a memory, but the gradual revision of a prediction. It is happening in the research that is beginning to emerge on phase-based treatment, schema therapy, and attachment-based approaches for complex PTSD. It is happening, but it is happening slowly, and it is happening without the institutional support and funding that single-event PTSD research has received. Until the research catches up with the clinical reality, the most important thing you can do is find a therapist who understands the difference between single-event trauma and relational trauma, and who is not going to blame you when the single-event treatments do not produce the results you need. You are not the problem. The evidence base is the problem. And that is a problem the field, not you, needs to solve. Thank you for listening to the Relational Safety Podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can read the full written version of this episode with complete references on my blog at healingnarrativescounseling.com. I'm Stephanie Underwood. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.